Welcome everyone. Thank you very much. Appreciate you guys coming to check this out. So today we're going to be talking about accurate depth of field in camera visual effects. That was the on-brand title. My title was the good, the bad, and the blurry. So, quick introduction from me. My name is Ben Kidds. I'm a solutions architect. I'm on the M&E team and focus on virtual production. And my main speciality has been in camera visual effects. So, from 2019 when I joined through to today, I've been supporting customers all over the world, either remotely or on set, and being part of the movement of moving to LED in-camera visual effects, and it's been quite a journey. And as I know many of you have worked in in-camera visual effects before, you'll know some of these challenges that we face on set. So technology, there's an awful lot of it on set, and time, there isn't a lot, and the confidence in making decisions with a lot of technology where there isn't a lot of time, the confidence to know what the decision that you're making is correct is important. And one of the areas that has been kind of a challenge that's had ambiguous kind of solutions was depth of field. And so today we're going to sort that out. So chapter 1. The problem with depth of field on the LED wall. So just going to go through some illustrations of the problem. Here's an example frame. This is, as you can see, typically we're seeing a depth of field. We are seeing those objects further away from camera, blurrier than the ones that are close to the camera. And we're focused on that telegraph pole that's right near us. So that's kind of a 3/4 looking down, bird's eye view on this setup. But if we introduce an LED wall into that, and let's just say that our end display camera, our virtual camera producing the image for that wall, is rendering the exact same depth of field of the virtual scene as is in the real world camera, then you're going to get a blurry image on that LED wall. So we're kind of filming it twice. On this side-on view, I've attempted to illustrate how we can describe blurriness of an object as it gets further away from camera. And as you can see, this furthest telegraph pole is very blurry, and the one that's nearest the camera is nice and sharp. This red line here is the LED wall, which you'll also notice has got some degree of blur to it. In in-camera visual effects, however, everything's actually at that depth. So you've got all of those blurry telegraph poles rendered on that wall, plus the blurriness of the wall. And this is what we get. Now, actually, that looks kind of right. I mean, look, it's blurrier in the background than it is in the foreground, right? But a DP will see that and go, whoa, what's going on here? That's not right. And of course, it's because if we look at our original image, it should look like this. And so what we're seeing here is the effect of that blurry image being effectively blurred twice. We call it double blur. Just as a note, if you see this little triangle in the top, I'm going to be doing a lot of like AB, AB, AB in this talk. And the reason I put that red triangle up there is just so it's easy for you guys to track what I'm looking at. What I'm suggesting is the red triangle is always a shot that has been put via the LED wall. So really what we'd like to see, the goal here, is that when we go to the LED wall, that happens. Like nothing, right? That's the ideal. That's the target. So with that in mind, what is the correct blur for an LED wall? Well, in that scenario we described, we had an end display camera and the real world camera with the same fizz. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, fizz is focus, iris, and zoom. And this kind of this is common with lens encoded systems where you've got lens encoders on the camera and you just take all of the focal length, the aperture and the focus distance, and you put that onto your cine camera in Unreal. And what you typically get is, depending on your focus distance, you can see with this real world barrel sat in front of the wall, you can see how much sharper that looks to the naked eye on the wall compared to the virtual barrel that's directly behind it on the wall. Now, barrels aren't flat, so they're not perfectly at the same depth, but I mean, they're sat next to each other. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that's going to look wrong. And in fact, it does. So here's a reference depth of field. And by reference depth of field, I mean, this is what we would expect to see if things are all correct. And then once we've passed that through an LED wall, it's a heck of a lot blurrier. And so what we can say is, in this scenario, is that when you match your focus iris zoom settings, you get too much blur. Another common scenario is just to turn the depth of field off, right? Well, actually, that could work, right? Because now the barrels to the naked eye are at least looking right, and now if the lens, the real world lens, is to be focused somewhere in the space, it's at least going to blur the barrel naturally. So let's take a look at that. Here's our reference depth of field, and for LED wall, oh look, the barrel's actually looking pretty good. Well, there's not a bad match there. There's some lighting changes, but look at the background. We've kind of really destroyed our sense of depth back there. So we fixed one thing, we broke another. So we can say that turning the depth of field off just equals not enough blur. So what is the correct blur for the LED wall? Well, it's going to be something in between, isn't it? I mean, it's got to be. But how and how much? And I'm sure there's many of you in this room have played with this issue and experimented and have your own solutions. You know, is it a case of offsetting the aperture of the end display camera? Is it a case of doing a focus distance offset? Is it maybe a mix of both? Is it maybe something epic required? Well, spoiler alert, it was something epic, and it's in 5.4. And for the rest of this talk, because this would be a bad place to end it, we'll dive through and explore the journey and how we know what we've done is correct, and also impart some knowledge, hopefully along the way, that when you're on set, boosts that sense of confidence of knowing that that depth of field on the wall is correct. So, how did it get to 5.4? Well, lots of R&D shoots. Essentially, what we wanted to do was recreate the problem and have a go at solving it. Essentially, what we did was we shot a bunch of checkerboards out in the real world, in our offices and spaces, and then we effectively filmed those at different focus distances, different apertures, to just created like a bunch of reference depth of field, and then we recreated those exact shots but on LED walls to recreate the issue, and then play with aperture offsets, play with focus distance offsets, play with all sorts of things until we could resolve it. And we created a blueprint that basically was like a cine camera with all of those controls available as an offset, so we could in real time composite, like via OBS, you know, what we were seeing on LED wall versus what we shot in the reference depth of field, and see what it took to get a match. As a diagram of how that looks, this would be effectively what we shoot as a reference, and then here's what that looks like when you've made it as an in-camera visual effects shot. This is the LA lab shooting the reference, and the LA lab shooting it as an in-camera visual effects shot. London lab, you can see how I've maximized the amount of space I can use in that office. This is me at about midnight waiting for, have the office to myself to do this, and here it is on the LED wall. And so here's a reference, and here's an in-camera visual effects shot equivalent, and as you can see, we've reproduced the issue. Those checkerboards are blurrier. But before we solve this, let's just double check that all things being equal, we could just do an offset and it would be solved. But what if actually the Unreal render we're starting with isn't accurate? Okay, let's just check that. So we wanted to do that. I mean, I was confident because I know the engineers that have written the depth of field, but let's just double check it. And so if we compare our reference depth of field to just a render from Unreal, this isn't via an LED wall, it's pretty good. Ignore the background plate because that is a plate at the wrong depth, which is why that doesn't match. But and ignore the color changes. But if you look at these checkerboards, those grids are really good match. This bokeh back here as well really stays the same size. There you go. The ones down the bottom look larger, but that's like a GI contribution that confuses that a little bit. So we knew that, at least Unreal was rendering the correct depth of field. And with that, we thought these shoots are a pain. Let's do this virtually. Can we just virtually recreate this problem? And we could. And so we created a virtual depth of field rig, and it helped us rapidly iterate. And it also helped us communicate the problem internally so we could collaborate. And it also meant that we had something that we could pre-validate our solutions on. So I'd thoroughly recommend, if you're ever trying to solve a problem, validate that you can do it virtually first, because it will save you a lot of time. And so one of the theories that, one of the ideas that I'm sure you might have played with is like, well, if we want, we know that the objects at the wall depth need to be sharp, so that at the very least, the real world lens is blurring them naturally, not double blurring them. So maybe an easy offset for that would just be to set the focus distance of the Unreal camera, the end display camera, to where the wall is. So we get that barrel nice and sharp, and by doing that, we get some depth of field in the wall. Seemed like quite an easy solution, and so we tried that. So here's our reference depth of field, and here is a focus distance offset to the wall. Now, if you look at the good boy sign at the top right, you'll see that's a really good match. When I say really good match, there's obviously some differences once it's shot through an LED wall, but even virtually. But if you actually look at the background, and the further into the background you look, you can see the image gets sharper. And so to summarize all the things we tried, focus distance offset, it compensates for the objects that are at the wall depth, right? And that's great. And that's really important because that's where your physical set and your virtual set need to blend visually to create the illusion of the LED wall not being there. So that's great, but it makes the background too sharp. So now, the DP's not happy. You could do an aperture offset, but essentially it reduces double blur. Like, it just keeps reducing it until you've got no blur on the wall. And then that's the same as having no blur on the wall. We saw that's not good either. You can do a combination of both. So you could set the focus distance to the wall and then do an aperture offset. And it's great. It fixes the objects at the wall depth. It fixes the background, but your midground's too sharp. And anyway, even if we did all those offsets, you're going to pass all those offsets via take recorder down in post, confusing everyone. Right, we'll take a little moment, little interlude, to discuss circle of confusion. Right, it's an important concept, so and we'll need it going forward. So let's do a bit of this. Now, in a perfect lens, light comes through, converges at a point. In a very perfect lens, that point is infinitely small, right? It's a single point, and it would be so small that it wouldn't be visible and it wouldn't cover more than a pixel on a sensor. And so one way of describing circular confusion is to say, what is the minimum convergence of light that is useful to us? And the reason that's valuable is because circular confusion is used to calculate depth of field. The other way of describing circular confusion is to look at it from the circle of least confusion. And that's described down here visually because this is more like the way a real world lens works. It's not perfect. The rays aren't all coming in at the right perfect angles. And so the convergence point is actually a large area. And then so the other way you could describe circular confusion is that that's the smallest the light can get once it's passed through that lens. If you want to play with this kind of as a concept, intuitively do this. I'm sure you've already all done that at some point in your lives, but you could argue that where the magnifying glass focuses that small amount of light, you could say that the circular confusion for a magnifying glass is at the point where you've sort of converged the optimal amount of energy to set fire to the wood. Now, in Unreal, circular confusion is used to as a parameter in our formula to blur a pixel. And so basically, over distance from camera, and based on the focus distance, the circular confusion gets larger, and that essentially we can just call circular confusion like the blurriness of a pixel at depth. And as that relates to in-camera visual effects, well, here's that circle of confusion over distance. This line here, this point here being the focus distance. Below this line are negative values. That's effectively your foreground blur, and everything above this is your background blur. But of course, there's an LED wall. So if this is a circular confusion of 0, because it's like no blur, it's in focus, you can see the LED wall has got a larger circle of confusion. If you'd like to learn more about how depth of field works in the engine, just Google Life of a Bokeh. It's a fantastic presentation about how our depth of field works in Unreal by Guillaume, and you could learn a lot more on that on the kind of rendering side rather than on the light physics side as I'm describing here. So interlude over. We ran out of rope with our blueprint. We couldn't solve it you could solve it enough, but not to the degree that we were satisfied with, and not in a nice, easy, intuitive way. So we wanted to go beyond the blueprint to resolve this. So now we're all experts in circular confusion. we can continue talking about this. So one theory we had was that if we just took this circular confusion value that's at the wall and we just subtract it from all the values, then maybe we just solve it, because the issue is that we've got this extra blur contribution from the wall that we want to take off. That's intuitive, right? And so that would look like this. That's what that effectful change to the circular confusion would look like. So we tried it. So here's our reference depth of field, and here is the wall minus a circular confusion of minus 0.004. That's in pixels. It's a tiny offset. But as you can see, good boy's looking great, but the background's looking sharp again. Wait a minute, that feels familiar. That's exactly the same as doing a focus distance offset. That's annoying. So at that point, getting a little frustrated with what the answer might be, I effectively photoshopped a solution just to cheat and find out what the answer was. And the way I did that is I rendered out different circular confusion offsets as different passes, and I just basically comped where they matched the reference depth of field. Just sort of looked at the reference in Photoshop, looked at different layers, and just painted a matte that blended it all together. And so when I compare that with a reference depth of field, getting somewhere now. You can see we've got some better results. And it's not perfect. For example, you can see this street light here. As I flick between the two, you can see that's still getting a little bit blurrier. But generally speaking, the depth of field, the amount of blur throughout the image, is matching. And so what that actually ended up looking like was that. But we don't really do, going through Photoshop after shooting stuff on the wall is not exactly real time. So we needed a dynamic solution. But that mock-up enabled the engineers to know what we needed and start working on a solution. I found this in their notes and I thought it was fantastic. And so Alex and Tristan began working on a solution for this. And essentially what they did was they had a bunch of techniques to try, but the one they fell upon in the end was to essentially double blur a point light and then adjust the circle of confusion on that until it was minimized in terms of double blur, and then effectively map that all out. So the way that they measured the error was with a root mean squared, and essentially they mapped all of that into a lookup table. And the reason for putting it in a lookup table is then it was easier to change that lookup table in Unreal without going, of anything other than changing an asset. We didn't have to keep rebuilding the engine every time we wanted to make an adjustment. And so we actually created a bunch of lookup tables so that we could see which ones were working the best. So, did it work? Here's a reference depth of field rendered from Unreal, and here's a frame that we then shot in the LA lab. And actually, apart from a few objects that disappeared once they were on the wall, yeah, you can see it's a good match. Again, it's got that issue with the Bokeh not being perfectly the same. And actually, we'll come to some caveats in a bit, but that's going to be one of the limitations of this. And it makes sense because if I produce a Bokeh that's on the wall that's super sharp, the wall is still out of focus, right? So we did some more validations. And so we set up a test shoot. This was so that we could have some further validations, but also to create the content really for communicating all this. So if you guys could kill the lights, it would just help with the contrast on this. And the house lights, thank you very much. There we go. It's like being in a suite now, isn't it? So here's our ground truth on this shot. This is a 50mm spherical. And here's our double blur as we saw before. Here's our no blur, so you can see how much of the background we've destroyed. And then here's our compensated shot. So you can see there's some changes there. We described, there's some limitations in the amount of blurring that you're going to get still. But generally speaking, is a good match. Now, you'll notice that, that she hasn't moved or changed. And so for transparency, in order to communicate this, we essentially shot the actors on a green frustum, or blue frustum in this case, because she was wearing a green shirt, and then shot clean plates with different settings on the wall so that we could do this comparison. But we also support anamorphic lenses as well with this. So this is where we did a rack focus because we wanted a range of focus distances that we could check on. And so if we focus back on Dorado here, this is our ground truth. This is rendered from Unreal. And with this, with the double blur, it's really quite aggressive. And now if we enable compensation, you can see how much correction we're actually making to that shot. Interestingly, if we compare that with no blur, the no blur actually looks quite good. With focus distances that are very close to the camera or closer to the camera, no blur can actually be quite a good result on the wall. And the area where you're going to notice that better result is in the Bokeh, just here. So that's compensated with our feature, and you can see you've got that slightly soft Bokeh, and if we turn the blur off, we get a little bit of sharpness back on that. And if we compare that with our ground truth, you can see it's a little bit, in the Bokeh at least, a bit more faithful. And so One of the things we'll come to shortly is having that ability to, in certain scenarios, favor the bokeh, and we have a setting for that. But generally speaking, we're really happy with that match between the ground truth here, the reference depth of field and the compensated shot. If we go to Sarah's focus distance and compare, you can see we've got a decent match. Again, there is obviously still some double blur. We've mitigated it to the minimum, really. If you compare it, the reference with no blur, we really do not have any blur on the wall. And if we compare it with double blur, you can see how, the barrels no longer feel like they're at the same depth. And you can see when I compare double blur with compensated, which I'm doing now, it's only subtle, but it's enough to bring some of that sharpness back into the barrels. And again, I think it's really important to get that bit right, because even if you did have a background that maybe wasn't exactly the depth of field that would have been there in the real world, we don't want to destroy our relationship between the physical set and the virtual set, because that's what's going to break the illusion. So, how do you use this feature? Well, switch it on. It's very dynamic. It's been designed to allow you to switch it on and leave it on. The only reason it's not on by default is because it's an experimental feature, so we didn't want to force it on you. But I think once it's on, and hopefully you'll all agree once you've tried it, you can just leave it on. It's found in the in-camera visual effects component on the end display config actor, nearby where you will have had your motion blur controls. And yeah, just enable it, and its default settings give you compensated accurate depth of field on the wall. There's some prerequisites, but I think you've probably all got these anyway. You need tracking, because we need to know how far away from the wall the end display camera is. You need an accurate end display mesh, because otherwise, you might know where the camera is, but you don't really know where the wall is unless you've got a decent wall mesh. But neither of those things needed to be perfect. In our testing, we were a foot out in terms of our measurement in the real world versus our measurement in Unreal, yet we were still correcting for this accurately. So it's a forgiving target. It is important that you're on a minimum engine scalability of Epic, though, because otherwise you're using a legacy depth of field and we're not compensating with that. Lens encoding isn't required. You can. It's important that your real world camera and your end display camera have exactly the same lens and camera settings, like your film back and stuff. The benefit of having lens encoding, though, is you're not constantly, if your DP's changing aperture, changing focus distance, you're not having to manually enter that onto the cine camera. If you've got lens encoding, the entire feature is dynamically updating, so you can rack focus in a shot, and you can jib and move around, and it will be being constantly updated and corrected and compensated on the wall. We discussed the bokeh caveat, but also bear in mind that most lenses, especially cine lenses, will be in T-stop, and dependent on the lens, that will be different to its f-stop. T-stop is the transmission; it's the amount of light that is measured through the lens. F-stop is actually the size of the aperture opening. Unreal is expecting an f-stop for this. So either estimate or calculate your f-stop from the lens. The lens manufacturer may well tell you what the f-stop for a T-stop lens is at wide open aperture. But in our example, our anamorphic 85mm was a T 3.24, but actually that converted to f3. But it really depends on how many coatings there are on the lens. That difference might be larger. I wouldn't sweat it too much. If you're getting a result that looks great in the monitor, then you're good to go. The only reason we cared so much is that we were using this to validate something that we would say to you was correct. Bear in mind also that frustum overscan, if at the moment, if you use the asymmetric overscan, so you might be pushing the end display out of in a frustum overscan to all the way to the right, that can impact depth of field. But you can, if you see that happening, then you can compensate for that with a feature I'm going to show you shortly called depth of field gain. So the next thing down in this list was that we automatically calculate the distance to the wall. That's enabled by default. You could turn it off if you wanted to. Especially, I don't know, if you had a locked off shot and you didn't have tracking, then you would just measure the distance to wall and enter it in that field, would be an example. We do have a distance to wall offset. We put this in here in case you guys wanted to experiment with playing with what is the main variable in this formula, which is distance to wall. But typically, I expect you would probably just leave that at 0. Now, depth of field gain, discussed this a couple of times. This is the creative control. Okay, so we've corrected for depth of field on the wall, but we know that that's not always what you'd want. And so we've got this gain here that essentially, if that value is at 0, you have no depth of field on the wall. If it's at 1, you have the compensated accurate depth of field on the wall, and it goes all the way up to 4. And what that looks like, if I go back to Premiere and go along this timeline a little bit, let's zoom out. And here's what that looks like. So as I'm scrubbing backwards and forwards, you can see I'm changing the depth of field gain. And essentially what that's doing is giving you this superpower to just like quadruple the speed of the lens on the wall, which is quite powerful, really. Likewise, if you wanted a deeper depth of field on the wall for creative reasons, then you can just reduce it until you get something that you're happy with. So this, like I say, is the main creative offset that you then have. Here's what that looks like to the naked eye on the wall. And what's worth noting there is that whilst we're changing this depth of field gain, what we haven't done is destroyed the relationship between the barrels. So we're not doing some offset that then breaks one thing but fixes another. So it's a really neat solution. Where am I? Apologies. There we go. So as I say, value of 0, no depth of field. As we discussed earlier, in some shots, maybe that's the best. If you've got a close to focus to camera, like a close up of someone, and the camera's very close to that subject, and the background is a bunch of street lights at night, that might be a really good option to just turn the depth of field right off and retain all that sharp bokeh. As an example of where you might want to use this in lower values. So next up is the lookup table. It's just down there. There are some other ones that we've got in the engine that you might want to try. If you want to write your own, that's where it would go. As I say, this is an experimental feature. So although for the most part, you just need to switch that on and then adjust depth of field gain, we did want to keep these other options open so that you guys could experiment. So in conclusion, essentially we wanted to give the community a feature that takes that ambiguity out of offset of knowing that the depth of field is on the wall and that depth of field is correct on the wall. We wanted to make sure that we provided a solution that allowed you guys to spend more of your time creatively nailing the in-camera visual effects illusion, stopping scenarios where on set there's like 3 different opinions on how to solve something, and hopefully through those images we've shown that we did our due diligence to know that what we're giving you is the best mitigation really for having accurate depth of field on the wall and the impacts of double blur and whatnot. And so with that, open up to any questions. And I'll be around all day as well. So if anyone has anything they'd like to discuss, do let me know. Thank you, everyone.